Hi, today I am interviewing Dr. Megan Rose, the author of Spirit Marriage, Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings. I'm really thrilled to get a chance to talk to you. Thank you, Megan, for talking to me about the book.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I always love our chats, Brandy.
Me too. And so to talk a little bit about how you came to write the book, I met you at PantheaCon when you were presenting on the research that you had done. And I thought at the time that it was fantastic. It was a time to have this conversation. And I thought it was really going to go. It was going to really help people. So talk about how you wrote the book.
Yeah. Actually, you know what, Brandy? We met the year before. We met in 2019 because you did a theurgy panel with Tony and Bruce. And I went up to you at the end of the theurgy panel and I was like, I'm doing my dissertation research on an aspect of theurgy that's spirit marriage. And you were like, ooh, your eyes lit up and you were so excited. And we connected then. And then like the following year I was presenting on it and we reconnected then. But your work and Bruce and Tony's work on theurgy was really, quite instrumental in part of my research. And I'm super grateful for the work that the theurgists have been doing and presenting, and hopefully presenting more on in the near future.
I'm so thrilled to see it. It has come to fruit. We can hold it in our hands. So I'm very excited about that. Still excited.
So the question was like, how did I get to the topic of spirit marriage?
Yeah, and I know that you wanted to talk a little about the methodology that you used to get into the book. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, so I won't go too much into how I got to the topic because I've talked about that ad nauseum elsewhere. But I will say, in so much as that the topic chose me, I had a personal phenomenological experience of spirit marriage and was like taken out of left field. I mean, I'm a religious studies scholar by training. I have a seminary degree in ethics and social theory from the Graduate Theological Union. And so I knew about some of these practices, but I had no idea that they were still happening. And so when I started having my own experiences with this, I got really curious and I put my academic hat on and I began to research it. And it became really clear really early on that this was a huge topic, and that it wasn't just about the annals of history or anthropology, that this was a contemporary practice, and that to really do it justice, I needed to ground it in an academic framework, to just give myself a really strong foundation and a really exquisite protocol to approach the material, because the material can be kind of ungrounding and it can be it's really edgy and in some ways transgressive material. And I felt like that for my own experience of researching it, because I'm an embodied researcher, meaning I don't just think about it up here, I sort of take it into my whole being. And as somebody who is a practitioner scholar, I was going to be practicing this as I was studying it. So I needed to find a container, a place that I could do the research in a really a really rigorous kind of way. So that's how the PhD came about. I actually went to do the PhD so that I could do this research. and like I said, I realized that it wasn't just about doing a theoretical piece on how has this been practiced historically, but it was for me the intersection of like lived experience practices that got me really excited. And so I chose really early on to take a qualitative approach, which is really focused on stories and experiences, and to take a methodological lens, take on the methodological lens of phenomenology, narrative, and heuristics. And those are big words that essentially mean, how do people have a personal experience of this practice? And with that, there's always the challenge of talking to one individual does not speak for an entire people or an entire tradition. But as phenomenologists and as narrative story collectors, we understand that one story is very powerful and it can tell us many things. And as somebody who has a background in ministry, I'm very interested in the intersection of story and lived experience and transformation, and how just hearing somebody's story can powerfully inspire and perhaps speak to us of our own experience, and mirror back to us of our own experience. And so I chose to do the research through the lens of what's called organic inquiry. And organic inquiry is this wonderful transpersonal approach to research that says research isn't just about getting out a book or looking at data or even interviewing somebody. It's about being in a numinous conversation with not just the person, the human that you're interviewing, but also all the other spirits, if you will. What organic inquiry calls the daimon, right? Going back to Plato's daimon, right? The tutelary spirit, which is the intelligence, is the entity that is guiding the research, that has poked you to do the research in the very first place. So organic inquiry really understands that inquiry in itself or research in itself can be a sacred and transformative process. And so I thought that was a perfect lens to look at this, since I was already getting poked from my own personal experience. And then what I did was I went around, I put out the call for who was having spirit marriage experiences. And I did some ritual around this and said, okay, daimon of this book that I'm writing, this research that I'm doing, it wasn't a book yet, it was a dissertation at that point. And I said, okay, daimon, who do you want me to interview? Like, bring them into my circle, bring them to me. The individuals, and and I talk about this in the book, just synchronicity after synchronicity after synchronicity happened to bring what ended up being 9 different individuals that qualified, because I had a list of a laundry list of qualifications that I needed to for methodological rigor that the school was holding me to, which is when you do human live subject research, you have to follow all these protocols. And so they were holding me to a certain amount of standards of who I could interview. And so I found 9 different people that fit in that, and luckily enough, across 7 different traditions with a variety of different backgrounds and ethnicities and age groups and education levels and stuff. So the demographics on it was as diverse as 9 different people can be.
Oh, thank you. I have wanted to hear you talk about that because it was so exciting the first time that we started talking about it. It's a wonderful methodology that I think more people could adopt as writers as we move into these kinds of topics. And I also want to know, now that the book is out and it's out in the world, how has it been received? I remember looking at you making this presentation and thinking, there are going to be people who say, I do that. I am so glad someone's talking about that because it really validates my experience. And you were talking about how stories can do that. So I'm sure you've had a range of responses to the book. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, well, I by and large the reception of the book has been really positive. People email me from all over the world saying, "Oh my gosh, I thought I was the only person."
Right.
And I thought that I was losing my marbles, or I thought that maybe I was making this up, and I got your book and I see myself in the Shakti Tantric story, or I see myself in the Fairy Seer story. And that's the point, right? Is to be able to see and resonate and validate. And like I said, as somebody who has a ministerial background, that's really the heart of what I'm trying to do. Rather than teach or being didactic and instruct or say, this is the only one way that this happens, it's really not about any of that. It's about giving stories that allows people to feel seen and resonate with. And, some of the critics have been people who don't feel seen or resonated with in the material, who feel that the material, and who feel that my interpretation of the stories is not their experience, which is totally fine and valid. I say at the very beginning of my like practice section, which is the third part of the book, is like, okay, we've got all these stories, we've heard all the history and the anthropology, we've listened to all these people's stories, now what? And at the beginning of that section of the book, I say, mine is not the only one right or true way of interpreting this. You may read all these stories and have totally different conclusions that you come to, or totally different themes. Cool, that's great. What I'm trying to do is open up the conversation. And so I think a lot of the criticism has just been, some people don't like the term marriage, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And I say in the book, there are other terms that are used: indwelling, co-walker, somebody recently used the word communion or merging or mingling. There's different terms. I use the term marriage because that was the term that was given to me by the entity that contacted me. And also we kind of understand what a marriage is, right? We understand that it's a bond or a vow that two people take, maybe for a lifetime, maybe for just a period in time, and that like it elicits an understanding of deeper commitment, right? And maybe, and this is why I chose the word intimate, maybe intimacy, but intimacy looks like a whole bunch of different things, just like marriage has looked like a whole bunch of different things throughout time. So that was another, critique, is that, well, really, we're just talking about spirit communion, or what's one of the terms, like, a tutelary spirit or a teaching spirit. And there's been some like, well, what's the difference between a tutelary and teaching spirit and a spirit that you're married to? And, again, I think that the research certainly shows that we can have a variety of these types of relationships, and that one might actually step into a type of married relationship with a teaching spirit. But it's by no means required to marry a spirit, but it is a possibility. And that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight, is that this is a possible practice, and that the goal and the outcome and the purpose of the marriage is as unique as the goal and the purpose and the outcome of a human marriage, right? It runs the gamut. And I think in the book, what I came to, and certainly my co-researchers, the people that I interviewed, who I should add, just as a methodological note, were all, so I interviewed them, and usually usually in person. Everybody except for one I interviewed in person, and it was usually a couple of interviews that I did. So I interviewed them, I recorded it, I transcribed the interview verbatim, word for word, and then I did what in narrative methodology is like condense stories and take story pieces out from the larger interview, because you don't want to just put a gigantic transcript, so I took transcripted segments, and then I talked about, my experience talking to them, and how I was, what I was sort of thinking, and the conversation, and I sort of told a story around it, and then I would give their transcripted excerpts. And this is, part of a methodological known protocol. And then they were all given an opportunity to read their stories and edit their stories and comment on their stories and clarify, and that was important, because that as a story collector, you know that, you know, you're hearing and you might be even transcribing verbatim what they said, but your interpretation of what they said is always through your filter, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the things as academics that I think is a boon, right, from the academic community, is that we know and we accept that we have a lens and a framework that we're looking at something through, and we own it. And I do that very early on in the book. I say, you know, I'm white, I'm, you know, middle-aged and middle-classed, and, you know, I have this background and I have this training and I have this, you know, cultural frame within which I'm looking through this lens. And all of that consciously and unconsciously factors into how I'm looking at something. And the best we can do is name our frame, right? We
Yep.
can't ever abandon the frames. That we can just say, I know that these things are to varying degrees perhaps influencing my interpretation. And so to counterbalance that, when you're collecting narratives, you ask the person that you're interviewing, please reflect on this. Please tell me, did I get it right? Please correct any, and, you know, and so I invited everybody. A couple people didn't, a couple people read the story. Most of them actually read the stories and said, yeah, this is great. A few people went and did some edits. Some people just were like, no, I'm fine. You can just roll with what you've got. So, but they were all given the opportunity to do that. And I think that, you know, there has been some critique around cultural appropriation because that I have talked to people in traditions that were not my own. But we're talking about an anthropological social science academic study. And that is the water that anthropologists and social scientists swim in. We talk to people about their experiences. We report on those experiences. We do the absolute best to make sure that they're clear and accurate. And that really doesn't fall under the auspices of cultural appropriation. You know, we're talking about a religious study that I did.
Because you're letting their voices shine through. And I want to say, it's just really impressive. The methodologies that you use are the gold standard. Being a scholar practitioner, doing the kind of transparency you do in your working with the informant. So I've been an informant working under this methodology, and it helps me to feel really seen, that I get a chance to take a look at what was said and then say, yep, that's my words. And so I really appreciate that a lot. And I'm going to say too that it's not really a surprise to see you getting sort of critique around this material, because first of all, women do get critiques. And also because of the subject matter itself. You dedicated the book to Ida Craddock, who was famously hounded to death for writing about spirit marriage. And you stepped into that. I think you talked about wanting to kind of dispel that energy a little bit. So I just want to kind of bring that to you.
Yeah. No, I very consciously did dedicate this to Ida as a form of soul retrieval for her. Yeah. So Ida was the first account that I encountered. So I had this numinous experience in the early 2000s of a spirit lover that was asking me to marry it. Had no clue what was going on. I went online. This was like 2002, 2003, and I did a internet search. And the only term I could think of was spirit marriage, because it was a spirit and it was asking me to marry it. Yeah. And the very first thing that I found was Ida Craddock, and an early website that the OTO had created in devotion to her, right? And to Heavenly Bridegrooms, and to, I think she had already been elevated by that time as a saint within that order. And I found her and I was like, yes, I knew I wasn't the only one. And so, you know, I read Heavenly Bridegrooms, and and then I started studying about Ida and her story. And incidentally, I interviewed Veer Chappell, who wrote one of the biographies of Ida. I interviewed him as part of the dissertation research. His interview didn't end up in the dissertation, but it was really formative because we talked a lot about Ida and about what she went through. And he had gone and read through all of her journals in writing his book on her. And so she was definitely one of my patron saints of the book. And when it came time to write a dedication for the dissertation and the book, I was like, I really want this book to sort of expiate the slander and the malicious attacks that she suffered, primarily by Anthony Comstock, and the persecution, right, that she experienced, because what she was trying to do, right, was this beautiful piece on women's embodied spirituality and women's sexual freedom and women's sexual rights. And she was just lambasted for it. And, and as you said, ended up taking her life because of how persecuted she was, and because of how, because that her family and the culture around her couldn't understand what she was experiencing, even though she had traced the roots very beautifully of spirit marriage back to, in her case, through mostly the Christian lens, but back to the accounts of the Nephilim and the Genesis accounts. But in any event, she was labeled as insane and sent to, an asylum and to, various different institutions, because that people didn't understand and couldn't accept what she was trying to share with the world. And I felt, really strongly that she needed her due course brought out to the greater population, and certainly to both religious and magical studies communities. Like, we need to be more aware of the sacrifice that she made to lay the early foundations for this. But as you said, you invoke powerful spirits and beings, and sometimes I think you end up, maybe taking on a little bit of that karma, because that, some of these critiques have not been very kind, and have been sort of bordering on libelous personal slander, and largely based in misinformation and just absolutely incorrect reads of the material, or just really sloppy scholarship, sloppy research. Like, some of the critiques, just, they're not doing their homework, right?
Yeah. And I think that those forces are out there still in the world, trying to suppress these voices, and to disempower the experience. I think it's really important to keep talking about it. And this is why I actually wanted to have this interview, because I think one of the ways that we counter that is that we come together as women and priestesses and support each other in this work, because we're all going to get those kinds of reactions as we go, especially into this kind of transgressive material. I think I would have, I wrote a book on sex magic before the internet. And I think that's what saved me. I think if I wrote it today, I'd be getting some of those kinds of comments too. But yeah. I also know that how many people have been helped by your book, and how wonderful, there is this reception here, but there's also a lot more hunger for that, and a lot more support for this message today.
Yeah. I think that, whenever you're bringing sexuality into the equation, it's just such a hot button issue, and we live here in the West. Well, there's two things. And I just want to put a pin on pagans and methodology, because there's something there that I want to speak to, but I'll go here first. And that is that here in the West, specifically in the United States, we come to our sexuality already wounded, because of the culture that we live in, because our culture is so damning around erotic energy. We either damn it, or we are afraid of it, or we suppress it, or we just have a over exaggerated sense of its importance, maybe. We have a very narrow lens around it. Let's just put it that way. And so whenever you combine spirituality and sexuality, all sorts of, people have opinions. And, in one of the interviews that I did, people were just irate that I was talking about spirits and sex, and as if this was some horrible, nasty, dirty thing, Right. And I'm kind of scratching my head, thinking, what is it? As a psychologist, I scratch my head and I think, what is it that people are so afraid of, right? With our sexuality and our erotic energy, that causes them to just sort of lose their marbles when you're talking about the combination of what is in essence, our vitalism, right? Our vitality, our orgone, if you want to use the Reichian term, this energy that vitalizes each of us, that looks a certain way in our pelvis, but looks really different in our heart or in our brow or at our crown. I mean, it's this, I had one of my Tantra teachers describe it as like the vital energy, or what in the tantric context is the Kundalini Shakti at the base, is like crude oil. And as it moves up through and we refine it up through the body, in that context, through the chakras, it's like refining crude oil up till it's like jet fuel, right, at the crown. And then we circulate that back down and through the body in this refinement. And that is at the core of a lot of the transformational processes, transformational psycho-spiritual processes, is this refinement of vitalism through the body for a variety of different purposes and outcomes. And you see it in the tantric texts, you see it in the Taoist tradition, you see it in the in some of the Sufi accounts. You see it sort of phenomenologically around the world. And it's sort of that practice that I think the ceremonial magicians and sex magic traditions have done a great service to bringing here to the West, but has still been largely vilified and kind of, a taboo topic for the more mainstream audiences.
You have a pin in pagan methodology.
Okay, so yes, so this piece of pagan methodology, I think is really important, because that in an academic setting, academics disagree about interpretations of texts and research all the time. And they write papers, really well-researched papers about, I read this text and I thought this thing. Well, I read this text and I disagree with you. And they rebut, and they write papers back and forth, and they're very well researched and very well argued. And whole camps and whole schools of thought and philosophy can sort of polarize around. But like debate, scholarly debate and discussion is absolutely understood, and it does not air into the arena of cancel culture, right? It is understood that we're going to have differing opinions, and depending on your lens and depending on your approach and your methodology and all these different things, you're going to have a different opinion, and that's cool. We haven't, and I say we because I am a practitioner as well as a scholar, we as pagans haven't really learned, I think, fully yet how to play nice in that ways. And I don't want to overly romanticize the scholarly debate. It can get nasty sometimes, and people can have, scholarly debate wars, but it is grounded in this sense of research and really understanding what you're talking about before you take somebody on. But in these more pagan spiritual circles, there tends to be these sort of flame wars where people will take someone on, and they'll take like one text or one statement or something that they assume about the person and blow it into this whole cancellation that is actually not addressing what you're actually disagreeing on. You're trying to get them, you're trying to invalidate their research or their argument or their practice or whatever, because you disagree with them, rather than having a discourse about it where you argue the counterpoint and make your arguments and cite your research and whatnot and whatever. So I think there's a page that pagans can really draw from academics in understanding that we can disagree, we can agree to disagree, and we can have strong opinions about how we disagree, as long as you, as one of my teachers said, as long as you cite your sources, right? Cite your sources, do your research.
It's something that the Theurgy Forum has talked about with Hercules Invictus. Hercules talks about his namesake, Hercules, being a person who transgressed and then went through a series of atonements. He said, in that kind of cultural idea, the having done something doesn't mean that you then can't contribute. And he offered that as an alternative to start thinking about, if you disagree with somebody, then you try to silence them altogether and ostracize them. So I think it's a really good conversation to have, an interesting context in the context of presenting research and doing work.
Yeah.
And before we finish, I want to ask you what you're working on now. What's your next book?
Yeah, well, my plan is to take the entheosis piece, the piece on divine awakening, which dovetails into theurgy and other practices, which I touch on at the tail end of the book, but which is an area that I think has some really juicy transcultural phenomenology around, and turn that into a book. So look more deeply at these transformative psycho-spiritual processes that really put us in a deep devotional relationship, right? Usually with a deity, and usually with our own deity, our patron deity, right? Our divine self is what I like, the term that I use, but there's lots of different terms for it. And so I want to do a book on that. That's sort of my next piece.
That's exciting. Well, thank you for talking to me. Before we go, let people know how they can get in touch with you and how they can learn more about your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me at drmeganrose.com, which is just my name there, and the little Zoom bar spelled out.com. And I have books and courses and a variety of different things that you can learn about on my website. And I'm on faculty at Cherry Hill Seminary, at the Pagan Seminary. So, and I will be teaching more courses there in the coming months and years. So look for me there as well.
Thank you so much. My cat's telling me it's time for nap. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandy.